I think you still recognize that.
All right. If this is still God's world, and I gather that we're of a consensus that it is, then there's no problem with the title. But if it's Satan's world, then we have a conundrum here. And when we look around at the world in general today, most of what we see is negative, isn't it? I mean, you and I, when we came from our home to our church this morning, we probably didn't see much negative. But I'm talking about the world in general. When we think about the world, it's pretty hard not to see the negative above the positive. There's turmoil, there's grief and strife and hunger and all these terrible things that are happening all over the world in greater numbers and to more people than ever before. It's pretty hard to picture that as God's world anymore. I would think that, I had a friend one time who said, "You show me God and I'll believe in him." Well, there were lots of things that I could show him, but he'd say, well, that's going to happen whether God was there or not. And he had already decided that God didn't exist and he wasn't important, or he didn't care about what he had created or something. He had eliminated God from his life. And he wanted me to show him that God was not. Show him God. And it was not an easy thing to do for a person who wouldn't recognize God when he saw him. When I was thinking about that, the negativeness of the world around us, have you ever gone out west and seen the Rocky Mountains rise out of the desert? I flew out there one time to Denver, I guess it was, or to one of the camping academy north of Denver. And we flew for, it seemed like hours, over nothing but flat land. And you could look down there, and every once in a while you'd see these little green circles in the middle of the ground, you know, where they're irrigated. It was beautiful in itself. A lot of hard work going on down there, I knew. But it was just like nothing for miles and miles and miles. And then all of a sudden, the plane did a turn, and I got to see out the other side of the window, other side of the plane for just a minute, and here was a spectacular sight. Because I was thinking, all that flat sand down there, why do those people try to dig a living out of it? And then, you know, it was like, who would ever want to live in such a place? And then I saw the Rockies, and it just about took my breath right out of me. It was beautiful. I almost made the mistake of signing up or accepting the job they called me to out there just because of the beauty of the Rockies. Maybe it wouldn't have been a mistake, but I thought it was at the time. Have you ever seen the White Mountains protruding through the clouds, or any range of mountains? We went mountain climbing one time when I was a kid. Well, I was an older kid, I guess. And we got up one morning, we were up on Mount Washington, in that area, Mount Adams actually. And my brother-in-law called me and he said, "You want to see something interesting?" And I went out, and you could walk out right to where everything stopped, and it dropped for who knows how far, you know, from that point on. But from there, you could look right out through the valley, and down about, maybe 200 or 300 feet was the top of the cloud layer. And you'd look out across there, that cloud bank, and it was just like, it looked like islands in a sea. Only I never saw a sea that color. It was beautiful. To see those mountain peaks sticking up through the cloud coverage, and you knew that it was raining down below, but it was beautiful up there where I was. The clouds were bright with the sunshine on it. And when I think of those things, I had to tell myself, that if this was a devil's world, we probably would not enjoy things like that. It would reaffirm my faith in the fact that this is indeed God's world. In fact, there's a statement in the first note in the lesson that says, in spite of everything, all that we see around about us that seems to point up the negative, it says we must never forget that this is God's world. And if we can remember that, it can help us through some pretty rocky times, pretty bad times, in fact. The psalm that we're dealing with this week, of course, is number 66, and the whole theme of the thing is praising God. And the very first question kind of sets the tone for this is, what does the psalmist ask the inhabitants of the earth to do? And of course, in the first verse, it says what? Make a what? Make a joyful noise unto the Lord. Now, our pastor for the last 2 or 3 weeks has been telling us some things about worship. You know, different formats that worship can take, and trying to impress us with the fact that there may be more than one acceptable format to worship. Sitting on pillows, standing up, sitting in pews, whatever they do. And I got to thinking about the aspect of music. Because this text says, sing, make a joyful noise. And when I think of a joyful noise, the first thing I think of is singing. Because in one place a little farther along it says, sing. Sing to the honor of God. Now, I've heard some pretty good singing, I think, in my life. I've heard some pretty bad singing in my life. I remember a kid when I was in, well, we call it grammar school then, but it's elementary school, first, 8th grade. And I think this whole thing came to a head when we were in about the 7th grade. This guy he was the biggest guy in the class. He was a good-looking kid. He was smart. He was a nice fella. He was a friend to everybody. And that was important to me, I remember at the time, because I was one of the kids who lived from across the track, and we were the target of most of the jokes and all of the harassing and that kind of thing. So he was kind of like a port in a storm, because I could always turn to him if I needed somebody to talk to or say something to, and I knew he wouldn't laugh at me or put me down or this kind of thing. But he couldn't have carried a tune if it had a handle on both ends. He had the worst ear for music. He was, I guess, what they call a tone deaf. Anyway, he didn't know when to go up. You know, a lot of people who can't sing at least know when the notes go like this that they should raise their voice a little, you know, go down, lower their voice. But he didn't know that. He didn't know anything about music, and he just could not sing. But I can remember, at least from the 2nd to 3rd grade on, we had a chorus, and a little kids chorus in the school, and he was always in it. And I liked to sing, and so I was always in it, but I could always hear him way above everybody else. And when I stood next to him, I had a tendency to sing like he did, because I couldn't hear anything else, you know, so I couldn't read music. The teacher would hum the song, you know, or play it 2 or 3 times on the piano, and then say, okay, now follow me, and here's the words, and that's what I tried to do. But he really couldn't carry a tune for anything. And I thought many times, that guy, he would sing with gusto when he sang. At the time, I thought he was showing off a little bit. But I don't know as he was. And I've thought many times since, you know, as much as I used to think the teacher ought to tell him to keep quiet or not let him be in the choir, the chorus or something, that guy was probably doing as much to honor God as the teacher was, as far as his music was concerned.
He was making a joyful noise.
Say it again?
He was making a
He
joyful
surely
noise.
was. It was joyful to him anyway, to make the noise. I was never quite sure that, I often wondered if it was a pleasure to God to hear such a ruckus. And of course, because we used to sing in the church, local church there. It was a First-day Adventist church, I remember at the time. But I do remember in the 7th grade we had a special program, and the teacher, and I heard her say it to him, now in this song, when we sing this song, you must make your mouth go only, but don't make any noise. And I thought to myself, well, at long last, they were going to block out that terrible ruckus that was coming from his side of the choir. But, you know, it hurt him. And I knew that it hurt him. And I felt terrible. I felt terrible because he wasn't going to get to sing, and I felt terrible because of all the things that I had said about his singing in the past. And if I had ever said them out loud, you know, it would have ruined the only friendship that I had, real friendship that I had in school. But on the other side of the ledger, we had a educational meeting of some kind out at Camp Berkshire a few years back. And there was a young lady who sang, and for the life of me, I can't remember whether it was the Lord's Prayer or the Holy City. There was one or the other of them, and I can't remember which one. But when she sang that song, I sat there, I wasn't the only one. The audience just sat there and couldn't move. She has a beautiful quality, and when she sang, you know, you knew she sang from her heart. The tears would run right down her face. She was experiencing the thing that she was singing. And when she finished, there wasn't a sound, and nobody wanted to break the spell. It was just the most beautiful voice I had ever heard in my life. And I thought to myself, I could die now because I've heard it all as far as music is concerned. Could never have this experience again. And lo and behold, that afternoon we had a meeting, late in the afternoon, and somebody right in the middle of that meeting jumped up and said, we would like to hear this lady, I forget her name, sing this song again. And I thought to myself, well, you know, that will ruin the effects of the first time that she sang it, if she does that. I said it to myself, of course. But she did. She consented to do it again, and it was the same identical experience. Well, I sat there and the cold chills just ran right up and down my spine. Hear that girl sing. You knew that she was singing to the honor of God. And she closed her eyes when she sang, so she wasn't watching the expression of the faces on the audience. She wasn't singing to us. She was singing for us to God. It was a beautiful experience. Probably we'll never hear such a thing again. But then I have the problem of today's music. I can remember in boarding school how much time we spent. I don't know what we were doing. I really don't. It was, when I think back, I know at the time that I thought that we were trying to show the young people that the stuff that they were listening to and singing and knew all the songs, they knew all the titles and half the songs by heart, you know, on the hit parade. They didn't know most of the questions you asked them in the classroom, but they knew all the song titles. They even know who sang them and who wrote them. And they could sing them, and when we had a program of some sort in the Saturday night where a lot of these songs were sung, and we spent a long time in committees deciding which ones could be sung and which ones couldn't be sung and this kind of thing. We heard a lot of feelings. I think we were convinced that that kind of music could not bring an honor to God, could not glorify God. To me, it was the kind of music that all you had to be able to do was produce about umpteen decibels in volume and have a range of about 5 notes and be able to get somebody that would plunk on a guitar. And that was it. And they called it music, and most of them you know, they didn't know how to, you listen to this music on the radio today, they don't know how to end these songs. They have to turn the volume down slowly and the thing just kind of fades away and they're still singing. I remember the first time I heard that, I wonder how long that person kept singing before he realized he wasn't singing to anybody after that. And yet, listening to Pastor Pooler the last couple of weeks or so, I've had to ask myself since then many times, I wonder how often we prevented a young person from singing right out to God. Now, we didn't prevent him from receiving a blessing, because God would bless him if the music was in his heart, I guess. But I'm a little less critical today of the music that kids sing. It isn't that I like it, I whit better. And I wouldn't sing it and I wouldn't listen to most of it. But at least I think I have gotten smart enough to know that maybe some of this so-called religious music that I don't particularly like, or listen to them, maybe there's a message in there, maybe they're communicating with God and God is being blessed by what they're doing, or blessing them for the sentiment that they're expressing. I don't know. I'm glad I don't have to touch that in the judgment and leave that for somebody else. Well, enough of that. Music is a form of worship, and we know that only too well. The angels sang when the creation took place. And you remember the story of Job, the experience that Job had. He was about to criticize the Lord for a few things. And he had some things to criticize about, I guess, if ever there was some. But in Job 38, I think, is the chapter. It's a beautiful chapter. There's any number of questions put to Job by the Lord, you remember, about where were you when I did thus and so? Where were you when I hung the stars in place and put the worlds in space? And where were you when all these things were happening? And the angels recognized, when creation was taking place, the angels were awestruck by the greatness of God. And they sang. I hope someday that I'll be able to sing with that band, because more and more, again, so I'm losing my voice, not just the quality, that went years ago, but I mean just the voice itself every once in a while, so I lose it. But someday I want to be able to sing like the angels sing with them. I don't think we have to wait until that time to honor God or to sing our praises to Him, because He fortunately accepts our best efforts. I have a hard time when our children were in the formative stages, you know, and it was a chore to get 4 or 5 of them ready for Sabbath school. And sometimes we didn't make it in time for the song service, and I felt cheated. I felt like I had missed. I told my wife one time it's the best part of the Sabbath school. But then they made me Sabbath school superintendent, and I didn't say that anymore. But I really felt like I'd been shortchanged some if I didn't get to song service. The music to me it did something for me, relaxed me, put me in a frame of mind, I guess, to receive the rest of the blessings that are there. I just wonder if a person can worship without music. Think a person can worship God without ever singing? What do you think?
Pretty difficult.
Seems like it would be hard. Yeah. Seems like it would be hard to do it without some kind of music. We were fortunate enough to visit our son in Africa 4 or 5 years ago, and we went with them on the Sabbath out to, you know, these little churches you read about in the mission quarterlies all the time, out in the bush. And it was about an hour and 15-minute walk. And we get out there, and here was this little grass hut a grass-roofed hut made out of mud blocks, and no doors on it, and of course no windows on it. And they had somebody had hauled a steel drum out there, a barrel, metal barrel, so that they could roll it in front of the doors so to keep the animals from coming in during the worship services. Because they wandered right in through in the building, you know, so you put this drum in the doorway and they'd just come and look over the top. And sometimes they'd join in the singing. It was humorous, but I didn't want to laugh because they were very serious about what they were doing. They had no musical instruments, but they had music. Man, it was really something. There were only 10 people in and they sang 8 parts. It was a beautiful thing to hear. Now, I didn't understand what they were saying, and I didn't know the song, and I couldn't join in with them much. But after about 5 minutes of it or so, you could kind of pick up the melody, you know, and you find yourself humming along with them, and just wish that you could join in with them. But I'd be careful not to burst out too loud because I'd be up here, you know, while they were singing something else. Well,
what you saw there was their way of worshiping God.
yeah.
It's doubtful that some of them even knew what they were doing.
Mm-hmm.
Just following there's something about that movement that moves in that direction of praise, and it's doubtful that some of them even knew who they were worshiping.
That's very
But
possible.
they knew there was something beyond what they could see in this life that had a feeling, had an influence upon them, so that they expressed it in that way which we find it difficult to understand. But somehow there is something between them and the Creator that made them joyful and express themselves in that form which we don't understand, but God understands it.
Yeah. But you know, when we heard them sing, we knew they had a joyful feeling. We knew that they were worshiping God. The best way, like you say, the best way they knew how. And although we didn't understand the music, I suppose, I have a feeling that many cultures of the world would be a little bit disappointed if they came and listened to us sing sometime. People from many cultures. The African people have such a range of parts when they sing that when they come and they hear everybody singing monotone, not monotone, but in one, you know, all singing the same thing. Everybody's singing the soprano and nothing else, no parts in it. It must be kind of hard for them to think that is this truly worshiping God? This is all they do. They all get up there and all sing the same notes. It must sound kind of flat to them. Maybe not necessarily musically flat, you know, as far as sharps and flats, but just one tone running through. Everybody's singing the same one. I would think would have to be kind of disappointing to them. In verses 3 and 4, taken from verses 3 and 4, question 4 asks this: what does the psalmist suggest that we say to God? And the key part of that, I like the New International Version interpretation of it. Says, how awesome are your deeds. Now this is a word that didn't get much use in my personal vocabulary until a few years ago when the kids began to use it. You know, everything was awesome. And one day I looked it up in the dictionary to see, you know, I knew what awesome had, the general idea, but I read some definitions of the word awesome. And that's quite a word. It's a very powerful word. And the New England International Version says, how awesome are your deeds. We can't even begin to comprehend what God has done. But we can express our reaction to it through our worship of Him. Whether we do it in music, or we do it in word, or we do it in, well, let me ask you, how else can we express our worship to God and our gratefulness to Him for what He has done, other than coming to church and singing in the song service? And are there other ways to worship Him? Other things that we can do that could be considered worship of God, other than just coming to church on Sabbath? There are some other things out there. Isn't our lifestyle and the things that we do in our lives, isn't that part of our worship of God? And if we do nothing with the life that we have, then I think that we're not fulfilling our worship of God, it would seem to me. I read this statement somewhere, that the greatness of God is a fearful thing to the wicked, but it's a launching pad for the heaven-bound Christian. The greatness of God. We could spend, forever just thinking about the kind of things that God has done, and He's done them for us. It isn't just a matter that He's done them for somebody else. And the beauty of it is brought out over in, it's under question number 5 in your lesson. Psalm 66:5 says, "Come and see the works of God." And then the next part of the lesson brings out how He not only did these things for us, but He has taken care of things since He did it. He created beauty in the world, unbounded beauty. And He put man here for a definite purpose, and then He didn't just walk away and leave the whole thing to man. Now, unfortunately, man has assumed that attitude in recent years, especially, I suppose, in that we have kind of acted like it's our world and we can do whatever we want to with it. And we have basically done whatever we wanted to with it, to the point where we've just about brought it to the brink of destruction. But God hasn't left the thing untended. There are several texts that were noted here in Genesis 26:24. He says, "I am with thee, and I will bless thee, and I will multiply thy seed." It's a promise. He not only put them here, but He'd be with us, until He came and took us away. And in Deuteronomy 8:5, it says, "The Lord chasteneth thee as a man chastens his son." It doesn't say He browbeats him or pounds him into the ground, but He directs us through adversity. I wonder what it would be like if we never had a problem. Never had a problem. I take my car once in a great while, years ago anyway, down to Brother Bidwell. I remember the last time I took one there, I couldn't make that car behave for anything. And after a couple of minutes under the hood, he says, "You haven't got a problem." He didn't know it, but I wanted to give him the car. But he showed me a simple little thing to do, and he says, "That's it." And I did it. He says, "If you can do that," and all I had to do was cut a little piece of hose and put it on and replace it. He says, "If you can do that, you don't have a problem." So I did it, and he was right. I didn't have a problem. But God allows, as we know, difficulties come in our life. Satan brings them in. God allows them to come. But they can serve a positive purpose if we allow them, if we'll permit them to do that. We know that.
It's hard to thank God for problems.
Yes, it is. And it's almost as difficult to think of thanking Him when you don't have any, isn't it? When do we mostly go to Him? When we've got a problem. Which brings us to another part of the lesson that I want to conclude with, and that is, it has to do with this business of going to God. You all know what foxhole religion is, right? Is that wrong? A guy's out on the battlefront and the shells are whining over his head, you know, and they're dropping closer and closer to us. He digs a hole in the ground and he gets into it and he says, Lord, if you will save me this time, I'm yours forever. I'll do anything you tell me to do. Now, Quarterly brings out that that could be a dangerous thing to do. In what sense?
Sometimes it doesn't last.
Yeah?
There's danger of our using it as an escape mechanism.
Okay. Yeah. And not only that, but we may make some promises that will force us to do some things that we don't want to do later on. And then, after having made a promise to God, we refuse to keep the promise. That's a problem too, isn't it? That could be dangerous. We can probably all think of times when, well, if we had time, I was going to ask each one to, or several of you to tell me what was the most frightening experience you ever had in your life. And then, as you thought about it, think about whether or not at the moment, at the time, you called on God. And if you did you feel that He was there answering? And if He was, how long did you remember? Now that's a long question. If I asked a question like that in school, you know, the kids would say, would you start from the beginning again? Because they would have forgotten the first part. But that's an interesting series of thoughts. I can remember a time or two when I was scared right out of my wits. I can remember being so scared one time that my legs felt like they were made of jelly. And my knees were just buckled. And I just knew it was over. I remember one experience in particular, and I guess to my credit, I was caught in between defending myself or depending upon the Lord. And I had decided I better help the Lord. And at the last second, and I'm saying it was the last second, I said, Lord, I can't do it. It's up to you. And I walked right into the thing, and it came out fine. Now, I didn't make any foolish promises. I didn't make any serious promises. But I surely put my life in the hands of the Lord, and I knew in my heart that if He didn't solve the problem for me, whoever was out there in front of me was going to solve it for me. And one way or the other, it was going to be taken care of. But I knew that if the Lord didn't do it in His way, through His power, that I was a dead man. It was just that serious. And I didn't even know how I continued walking because my knees, I could feel from the waist down as though I'd been paralyzed. Imagine what it felt like to be paralyzed. Because it's like I didn't have any control over what my feet did from that moment on. But it came out all right. Well, brings up the old question, I guess, is whether it's better to make a bad promise or no promise at all. Is it better to come to the Lord through some means, in some form, than it is not to come to Him at all? And that's something for you to think about between now and next week. I guess next week you'll have a joint lesson study. Okay. Alumni weekend they usually do. So we'll see you all in about 2 weeks.